So what I want to do is give you a global snapshot, and it's based on what we know, which is very little. So that's going to be, I think, the main message here is that we're slowly building up an evidence base that might ultimately lead us to be able to talk in a few years about the kind of programming interventions, let alone randomized control trials, that are done in the other fields that we've been discussing here. What we do know is that firearms are, one element, one part of the picture that is connected with overall levels of violence, but we don't have any sense of what the causal arrows look like. We don't know what exact role different regulatory regimes play, and how that might change over time, and I'm going to talk about that. I would also say that our debate takes place in a context that is probably similar to alcohol, and that is there is a lot of public misperception, and there is a lot of deliberate, especially in the United States, deliberate attempts to present very different pictures about the role of firearms. And there's some quite simplistic kind of accounts out there, too. So every time a massacre happens in a school or elsewhere, today's headline was 8 people in Florida who were 7 shot by somebody who then kills himself. There are renewed calls for things like assault weapon bans. There's no such thing as an assault rifle per se as a category, and you also end up concealing the fact that most firearms violence in the United States is not committed with those kind of weapons. So the problem is slightly different than the way the public discourse presents it. So I'm going to give you a quick overview. I'm going to set the context with lethal violence rates, which we all know about, and then say what do we know about the role that firearms play in this. See if this moves forward the right way. There we go. Okay, got it. Okay, this we all know, and we've been told this many times. The data is slightly different than what the WHO and UNODC has. It's a composite data set, so I'm not going to go through it, but merely to highlight that these are the, I think it's 36 countries who, between the latest year, have violent death rates that are greater than 10 per 100,000. Going from Ethiopia on the bottom up to Syria, not surprisingly, on the top. You will know that most of these are not war zones. Many of these in the top are in Latin America and the Caribbean. None of them are in Western Europe. Only a few of them are in the developed world. And broadly speaking, advanced industrial states have rates of lethal violence between 1 and 3 per 100,000. However, that's where most of the world's firearms are. So the first sort of paradox is the countries with some of the lowest violent death rates have also the highest rates of firearms ownership, and there's reasons for that. Okay, now to get to more serious. Okay, but which one do I press twice? Okay, that didn't. There we go. There. Okay, got it. Okay, so the first thing we try to do here is give a picture of what percentage of homicides are accounted for by firearms in some of these high violence contexts. Overall, UNODC estimates that guns account for about 46% of violent deaths, but it varies tremendously from region to region and country to country. So we have a few very high violence countries in which the firearms account for more than, in this case, about 80%. I'm eyeballing this, I have the actual numbers, but that would be around 80% of the total. We put the United States in there, although it's not technically a high violence country, above 10, but I think the number there is approximately 2/3 of the lethal violence is perpetrated with firearms. But there's a fair bit of variation in there. To say a few words about countries that are not on this chart, if you look at the UK, which has very few firearms, I think it's 6% of the violent deaths involve the use of guns. In Japan, which has extraordinarily strict gun laws and very few guns, it's less than 1% of the lethal violence. And so what you have in advanced industrial states not on this chart are overall rates of lethal violence that go between 1 and 3 per 100,000, but quite a lot of variation within those states in the proportion of those homicides that are committed with firearms. So it's 2/3 in the U.S. It's about the same in Switzerland and Italy. It's around 20 or 30% in places like Finland and Netherlands, and then we get to the UK and Japan. So we've got large variation in countries with low rates. So let's see what happens when we try and look at this by region. This is not self-evident, so I'll just walk through it very quickly here. The red line is the average. This is by region. We've kind of divided the world into slightly arbitrary categories here. But so the red line gives you what the firearms homicide rate is per 100,000. And the gray lines give you the regional average of the homicide rates. So this is the axis that corresponds to the line, and that's the axis that corresponds to that. In a world in which these things were related, forget about the causal arrow, you would expect that the bars would climb as the line rose. But instead, we don't have that pattern. We have, of course, at least some countries where the percentage of homicides committed with firearms seems to increase as the homicide rate increases. And that's this group. I think I've got a little pointer on here too, don't I? Right over here. But you have kind of other anomalies. You have states over here that have quite low rates of firearms homicide, but relatively low. Relatively high homicide rates, and the same could more or less be said about North America, etc. So there's no clear pattern that emerges here between homicides and firearms, except some sense that in a few regions, in particular Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a link, but I'm not going to make a claim about a causal arrow. So let's unpack that just a little bit here. And now I'm going to just say a few words about what we know about guns themselves, which is an important bit of data that really we don't have very much knowledge of. So the first thing is how many guns are there out in the world, and where are they? Okay, and this chart took many years to actually put together. I should say it's the work of the Small Arms Survey and a team of people. There are something like 990 million guns around the world. More than 3/4 of which are in the hands of civilians. This is a slightly misleading category because it also includes gangs, private security companies, etc. But even our most exaggerated estimate of how many guns are in the hands of gangs and how many members of gangs there are around the world, etc., it's still a very small percentage of the total. This is worth pointing out because when I talk to diplomats and foreign ministry and military people, they're all surprised because they always overestimate how many of the world's small arms and light weapons are in the hands of armed forces. So your Weberian monopoly on force is a little shaky if you look at it purely from the point of view of instruments. And law enforcement is relatively small. And probably these are the two numbers that are interesting to compare. Police forces are not generally that heavily armed. What's in here, though, is a lot of variation. And I'm going to give you just one fact, and that's, of course, the level of firearms ownership in the United States. I didn't draw the line on here, but about 300 million of those 765 are in the U.S. alone. Okay, and the U.S. has a firearms ownership rate of right around 100 per 100 people, a gun per person. Okay, and there's nowhere else on Earth that looks like that. Nowhere else, and that's I say that twice because a lot of Americans don't believe that. So you need to kind of repeat. And they say, well, what about places like Yemen? I say, yeah, Yemen. There's a lot of guns in Yemen. The figure there is somewhere around 55 firearms per 100. And then you get to places like Lebanon, which is 39, more or less. There's a margin of error, but I'm going to skip that. Finland, relatively high, which is about 37. And then a number of northern European states, including Canada, Sweden, and so on, that are clustered around 30 guns per 100 population. So those are relatively high rates, but they're nothing like the United States. If the world owned guns in the same proportion that the American population owns guns, there would be about 7 billion weapons, not just 1 billion. So the U.S. is a completely unique case, and that has some implications for research and a lot of implications for policy and a lot of implications for the way the international debate unfolds. So it's very hard to make comparisons. All the good research is done on the U.S., but given the skew, and I can talk about this a bit more, in the patterns of distribution and ownership, it's really hard to make some general findings, generalizable findings. Now, let me say something about the Global South. When we look at Africa and Asia, many countries in the Global South have relatively few weapons per population per 100. And that makes intuitive sense, especially in the poorest of the poor countries, because a gun is a capital asset that, unless you're engaged in predatory behavior, is not productive. And the joke is used, if you have a choice between a gun and a cow, you'll buy the cow. If you have 10 cows, then maybe in certain pastoralist communities you might think that you need to have access to a weapon in order to protect that herd. But it's a capital asset that isn't generally productive for most people, again, except those who perhaps use it for predatory purposes or criminal activities. But even in, let's call them middle income countries, in Central America, where there's, of course, skewed income distribution, so there are a lot of people who are relatively deprived and relatively poor. Levels of lethal violence are high, but levels of firearms ownership as an aggregate per 100 population are quite low. In Honduras, it's about 12 per 100. Guatemala and El Salvador, 7 to 8 per 100. So this is, and I didn't think about getting every country that I can identify for people in the room, so I'm not sure I have Brazil and South Africa at my fingertips, but we can look that up. But what that means is what we already know, which is the lethal violence is concentrated in particular groups who have access to firearms. And so it's the accessibility part of the equation that matters a little bit more than the aggregate numbers. Even in the United States, and we'd love to start being able to disaggregate this in lots of other countries, but even there we know that weapons ownership is highly concentrated. So the percentage of households that actually have a gun has gone down steadily in the last 30 years, but the number of guns in the households that have guns go up. You almost never own one firearm. And people who own one or two tend to kind of get a third or a fourth. They're cheaper than cars. You put them on the wall, you go to your club. And so you'll find a lot of people with 5 to 10 firearms. I should say a lot of men, because it is mostly men. Okay, so what does this tell us when we start to link up these different parts of the picture here? Well, again, there's a little bit of unpacking here. But what the idea is to group states by and this is, again, I'm talking about the firearms homicide share, so I suppose I could have put this in a different order before I talked about the guns. And this is just the rates of homicide and the share that are perpetrated by firearms. So here we have the high firearms homicide rate and high homicide rate countries in South America. Here we have a few kind of weird outliers that have relatively high homicide rates but not much guns. But almost all states are in here somewhere, and there's no clear line. And what happens is that if you run just literally right up that axis, you'll see that there's countries that have fairly high percentages of firearms homicide and others that have very low ones. And there seems to be absolutely no connection from that. When we line it up with civilian possession, if there was a perfect, simple, straightforward, linear relationship between civilian firearms ownership per 100 and the homicide rate, there would be a line. I want my line. There'd be a line that went kind of like that, right? Just intuitive. That's what would have to happen. Now, the NRA would love this slide, okay? To preempt a question that people are going to ask. And I've omitted the U.S. from this chart because firearms per 100 residents, it's over somewhere. It was about by Richard there. Okay, so the graph was impossible to present. So this, again, shows that there is just a huge amount of variation. No obvious link, and it provides some comfort to those who want to argue that the guns are not the problem. And I wish I could then do all the magic that Mark did with various other much more fine-grained bits of data, because I'm reasonably committed to the proposition that it's more complicated, that we need to start controlling for things like income levels. It's clear that in slightly wealthier societies where you can have unproductive capital assets, that gun ownership will go up, and that sort of makes intuitive sense if sporting and traditional activities are part of this. It also seems clear that accessibility and social networks in which firearms circulate are much more important. So in a country like Yemen, which does have fairly high violence, it may have a rate of only 55 per 100,000. But what it usually means is that within every kind of household unit, which is an extended family, not just a nuclear family as we would think of it, there is accessibility, there is access to a firearm, and these are deployed often in land disputes and other kind of tribal clashes. And so when you need one, you can get your hands on a gun. And that's what some of the anecdotal and more systematic research from gangs around the world also indicates, that ownership within a particular gang may be relatively low. And as we heard this morning, very tight rules about who gets to kill. But if somebody needs a gun because their mission involves something that it puts them at risk, then they're going to have it, and there's a high chance that it'll be used. So we really need to understand a little better how these factors interact, and not surprisingly, we're trying to work on that. The only attempt that's been made, and you'll see how poor it is in a second, and I shouldn't say it's poor, but it's not ours. It's the UN ODC has a little chart in their global study on homicide, and they do a couple of things. They have an 18-country sample in Europe. They do not, Angela's left, unfortunately, and I don't think she'd know off the top of her head. They don't tell you what the 18 countries are, okay? And so when you see selected European countries, you should get nervous that maybe somebody's not just nervous about the spelling error, but nervous that they may have selected a little bit to prove their point. But, roughly similar levels of wealth, at least compared to global comparisons. And so you have a number of countries that have very low percentage of households owning guns, that's less than 10, and they're greater than 15. And they just lined that up with the homicide rate per 100,000. So that would seem to suggest, okay, there is a bit of a link here, but note carefully that there's a decimal point, so that even the high violence countries in this particular sample have a firearms homicide rate of 0.5 per 100,000. And I didn't, because I don't have the sample, I would have liked to put what the homicide rate is from all instruments, just to see if that tracks. It's a bit tantalizing, and it's a start, and I know UNODC is a bit cautious about how they deploy some of this data. I think they're probably fairly brave to have even put that one out there, because they do get flack. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the distribution of firearms, a little bit about the possible links with violence. I should say a few words about regulatory approaches. Not particular programming, because we don't have a lot of that, almost none outside the US. But we've tried to construct a sort of database, and we started with common law countries that had vaguely similar legal codes and said, well, what, can we map out, because we always get asked, well, which countries have good or the best or strong gun legislation or gun control. And we struggled with that, and this is one example of Australia, which incidentally also has 8 different regulatory systems because it has 8 federal states, and so in that sense it's a little bit like the United States. But it highlights that countries have come up with a bewildering array of ways to regulate firearms ownership. You probably can't read those, so I'm going to give you an idea here. So we did a composite. We just said, well, what are all the different approaches out there? What can we find out about how states do this? Well, okay, they have criteria such as the age. Is there an age restriction? Is there mental health box that needs to be checked off? You can't own a gun if you have a prior of mental health. Is there an issue? In some countries it's drug dependency, drug addicts, or people who have entered the system for crimes related to drugs are not allowed to buy guns. Is there a criminal record? Do people have to have a reason? Some countries you have to have a reason, others you don't. Are hunters allowed to get weapons? Targets for professionals? Is it easy to get a permit for performance for public use of one sort? Are licenses time-bound, 5 years, etc.? How long does it take to get a permit? What kind of penalties are there for illegal possession? Do you have to have, are there particular conditions around the storage of the weapons? Penalties if you don't store? Can you carry in public? Most places not, but we all know, and you've probably seen the cartoons about the open carry movement in the United States, which is just weird, if I could say that. I mean, it's kind of an odd sort of notion, but it does correspond to the softly and big stick strategy of political discourse, I guess. And are there various penalties for unlawful carrying? And so those are the categories we used. And even in the case of Australia, we would come up with quite a wide variation among the different jurisdictions. And Australia has one country where there has been almost a randomized control trial, or at least a rapid legislative change as the result of some particular incidents that people can do pre and post measures on. we're not sure, once we keep collecting this, what it's going to tell us. And what we've toyed around with, and maybe some of you know more about how to do this, is thinking about indexes. Come up with an aggregate index and score some of these on levels of regulation. But I'm not sure that would then allow us to introduce that as variable into a complex mix of, what's the regulatory framework, what's the level of ownership, what's the level of firearms homicide, how is that linked to overall homicide, and then control for things like income level, et cetera. And you can see why this starts to become not just unwieldy, but potentially not giving us the kind of information that would be useful. So what do we know about this? And I've only got a couple more slides here. Phil Cook was originally, I think he was invited and couldn't come, and that was too bad because I partly shaped this around what I thought he would be able to talk about because he knows everything about, and has written some very good overview essays about both the gun control debate and what we know about various measures in the U.S. And if you read that carefully, you realize, and Phil is one of the few people that does not get targeted directly by the NRA for so-called junk science and others. And it might be because he's sort of more senior, or they think it's useful to have one person. But they go after researchers. I mean, they'll call deans of universities and your department chair, and they'll get letter campaigns. They have literally. The NRA and its friends have literally kind of squashed the research effort on this, including through legislative means that have restricted funding by the CDC on issues of firearms. And that was one of the only things President Obama actually managed to do, was authorize the possible use of CDC funds to study guns after Sandy Hook, but even that hasn't happened. So this tells you that there's really, in the U.S., we on the aggregate level, we don't know very much. We know that gun ownership prevalence has a direct effect on the choice of instrument. Okay, more guns, more gun use. What he doesn't say there is that that also would likely increase here lethality of violence or injuries, because obviously the instrument matters. It also matters for the public health costs. The prevalence, though, has little or no effect on the volume of violent crime. And that we would be able to conclude from the earlier presentations, because prevalence, if anything, has been going up in the United States. It's certainly been going up, whereas crime has been dipping according to other factors. So that's clearly not a simple relationship. And the only thing that they're left holding on to as a strong sort of public health argument is that lethality seems to be related to the availability of guns. Okay, where does that leave us? Well, this is my last slide. So before you ask questions, let me just say a couple of things about this. I made two points, and I'm going to draw on things that other people have said. One is that we really need to think about this in network terms. Some people talked about epidemiological approaches, that is to say, studying violence and gun violence as an epidemic, or looking at contagion effects. It's very clear that there are network effects on this. There's one study that was done, a social map in an immigrant community in Boston, that literally did the nodes and put gunshot victims in this, people who were injured or killed. And the likelihood of being shot, well, they put it this way. They said it dropped by 25% with each step away from the node of a victim. Conversely, it means that the closer you are to somebody who's been victimized, killed or injured, then your likelihood of being injured increases by 25% in each step. And that's actually quite a strong network effect, right? And that tells you how you need to think about these things. I don't think anybody's tried that in places such as Brazil, where you probably have data, or South Africa, where you might be able to do that. But it means that it's ganglion or rhizome-like. It isn't spread throughout a population, and broad-based, whether they're legislative or regulatory approaches that are at the aggregate or population level are unlikely to have much impact themselves. Of course, they're relatively cheaper in most cases, though, than actually targeting interventions, and I can say a few words about that. And I think I'll stop there. There's lots of things I didn't talk about, which, if any of them give rise to questions, I'm happy to answer a few of them.